Sophia and Charles. Very pleased to meet you. It's the first time I've met you both. We're here to have a conversation around the psychosocial dynamics of the humanitarian system. That's a big question. We could start in many places. I'd like to start by just saying that my experience of being in the sector over 2 or 3 years, taking a deep dive, is that there's a real dissonance between people working in crisis situations, in development situations, and a heavy bureaucracy and a weighty centralization of bureaucracy in the system. So you have these two different emotional states. You have people, heightened awareness, really committed, things going on, and then this kind of machinery behind it. And there's a real sort of dissonance. And I wonder if you could just reflect on that as a starting point for our conversation.
I'm happy to give it a try. Thank you, Simon. Hi, Charles. Yeah, I think that dissonance and that split is felt actually at various levels, because we see it between organizations, often NGOs from the Global South and NGOs from the Global North, that typically are subcontracting. I mean, the word itself tells it all, doesn't it? You know, with also the hierarchy, the sub-element, you know, subcontracting. It's such a damaging word, and that's often what is used in the sector, who is above, who is below. So the whole relationship and the partnership is lost right there. And then also within organizations, that often happens, you know, within NGOs as well, and different layers, because there's teams that are focused on the compliance with the donor and, you know, and the reporting, and then teams that are dreaming and are full of creativity. And then it happens often every time people have a meeting, you know, every time people meet with each other, when those tensions arise. And of course they're manifested there, but they're reflective of everything that circles around the aid sector, which is money and power and often fame and wanting to be on the front page, and all of that is just so damaging to, and the split is felt acutely every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very helpful. Charles.
Yeah, so many of us who started working in this space, especially through what you would call local organizations or national or subnational organizations, I think one of the things that was pretty clear to us early on was that we were working in a system that was still suffering from a colonial hangover. It was also clear to us that at every level within that system, there was a certain power dynamic. You felt that you were in a position, or you were valued as more of a implementation kind of machine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the ideas were conceptualized and then, you know, basically shared with you to implement. So it was clear to us that we, in terms of decision-making power, in terms of our ability to conceptualize and design initiatives that will really turn things around, we really didn't have that space and opportunity to do so. And then, of course, like Sophia has said, the resource conversation. I mean, from the word go, money was the most important resource. Even though a lot of times when you read the values of organizations, we talk a lot about people and being community-centered, but you know, money was everything, and the value was put on money. And so when we're having conversations even about assets, it was the money that was the focus. And so if you were a national or subnational organization and you don't have those kind of resources in terms of money, but you may have very strong links with communities, you may have built expertise over the years, or you may have deep connections, when valued, is worth a lot. these things were not really things that mattered in the equation of a project or in the equation of a program. And then we got a rude awakening when we realized that, you know, it was like parachute in, parachute out. It was almost like very ad hoc, kind of short-term projects where the thing, there was a lot of due diligence. The due diligence that was done for 10,000 euros was the same due diligence that was done for 1 million euros. And, you know, it was heavy. And all of these things were framed within what we term as a partnership. But the more we worked in this space, the more we engaged, we realized that this partnership was quite transactional. And it's not really a partnership in the sense, but it's more like a funding relationship. And so this has been going on for years. I'm just, you know, I was just telling somebody that I'm trying to get used to people calling me sir. It's really awkward because just yesterday I was an intern or a volunteer, right? So when I get nervous. I just like, no, call me Charles, right? Because when I came into this sector, people had been in this sector for years, but it could see that it was the same challenges that have replicated over time, right?
Yeah.
And for me, the good thing now is that we are having these kind of conversations more openly. There are much more initiatives trying to respond to some of these challenges, which means things are changing, but they may not be changing as fast as we want them to.
Yeah. That's very helpful. Thank you both. Let me pick up what you said. Let's do a deep dive into colonialism, because the humanitarian sector is premised on people who want to help a disadvantaged other, who want to help a suffering other. This is like the premise of the work we do. And I was trying to understand how, I mean, the colonialism, there's this one part of it which is pure power, you know, pure raw power, political power, financial power, economic power over another. But there seems to me another part of it where there's this salvation aid piece, where people come in because they want to help another, and even though they have the rhetoric of decolonization, the rhetoric of localization, the rhetoric, you know, they say all the right things and they believe the right things, and yet unconsciously, I still think there's a savior complex in there. Like I'm a good person, I want to be a good person, which means I want to help a poor other person, and that poor other person then is labeled as a victim or is disenfranchised in some way. Do you want to share some thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things you learn very quickly as you're growing is that you can have good intent, but it doesn't necessarily lead to good outcomes, right? And that is the thing. There's a lot of great, beautiful, lovely people in the development sector that mean well. Unfortunately, you work within a system that has been designed to work this way for a very, very long time. And to dismantle a system, you must then be able to create a new reality, right? Because one thing that a society abhors is a vacuum, and that's a recipe for chaos, right? So in as much as, you know, we're not very happy with the system as it is, because of course it still has colonial appendages. The question is, how are we creating a new reality? And to create that new reality, it means we need to have an idea of what we actually want as a global civil society. We can't create a new reality if we still do the North versus South conversations. We can't create a new reality if we don't really appreciate each other's expertise and knowledge and value each other's perspectives on issues. And so I find it difficult when we are having conversations about decolonization, because I think that a lot of folks, it's a very, very trendy word, right? It sounds really nice in the ear because it kind of brings up a lot of passion and, you know, we need to dismantle, we need to do this, we need to do this. But if we don't understand how deep-rooted colonialism is, right, we can't begin to appreciate how to decolonize. And basically it means going back and appreciating our authentic selves, going back and appreciating systems that may not be in the mainstream, that could make us uncomfortable. But these are systems that were driving our societies hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so are we ready for that? And it's more about a mental shift, but it's also a shift in where those that have benefited from the current system will let go of the power that they have, not to become weaker, actually, but to become stronger together and not stronger alone. Stronger alone is caused what we have now, where we have a situation in the world that Kate was talking about, where power is in the hands of a few, and all of a sudden there's so much chaos. But how can we be stronger and decide together? So there's a responsibility, I think, more on those who benefited from colonialism to accept that they benefited from colonialism, and then reach out to kind of work with those who are struggling to come out of the effects of colonialism to build this new emerging reality that I believe it can be done. But look, I understand the frustrations. I talk to people who've been in this space and are retiring, and they tell me, Charles, good luck. Okay, I mean, it's tough, but for me,
Thanks, Charles. Let me let Sophia jump in. That's
Sure.
Sophia.
Yeah, no, thanks, Charles. That's so helpful what you just said. And I mean, the question on colonialism in the sector, I mean, when I joined the sector, I joined it from the Latin American feminist movement, and I was coming with kind of the slogan in my mind of nothing about us without us. That was what defines the feminist movement. So I didn't come from that angle you just described, Simon, of, wanting to do good in the world, but more, and then I found, of course, organizations. I mean, most large INGOs and the UN, they were all created when most of the world was still in colonial hands. So it's deeply in the DNA of these large NGOs, and that cannot be simply kind of evaporated, wiped out. So it's also good to look at it straight in the eye. But what I find very, very difficult is, walking that tightrope between wanting to transform it from inside.
Yeah.
And in order to be accepted inside, sometimes you even have to adopt some of the language, some of the behaviors. You must speak eloquently in English, something I didn't do 30 years ago. You must kind of adapt to packaging ideas in like 1, 2, 3, like very, I don't know, just you have to adapt in order to even get in. And then you want to transform it from inside. And sometimes I think we all get impatient and want to also get out of it and punch it from outside, and it's a constant struggle of walking that tightrope. And that manifests itself. That's why I talked about every meeting, because I remember countless meetings with colleagues from around the world where, for example, colleagues from Latin America, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia, present an idea, maybe not in perfect 1, 2, 3 and eloquent English. And then somehow, a colleague that does speak English well and can package that idea, picks it up and frames it in that way that is kind of seen as the universal language that we all need to adopt and adapt to. And somehow everyone latches on to, oh, yes, so-and-so is right. And we all kind of build strategic plans and annual plans around that idea, because those that were in the meeting that actually presented it from that more Southern perspective were not listened to in the same way. I mean, let alone translation. You can see on Zoom calls when there's translation offered, even when someone speaks in French, in Spanish, in Arabic, how everyone is doing their emails meanwhile and is not even attempting to, even that disadvantage is huge. So I can see it every single day, like the ideas then that get promoted to which we latch onto, then flourish in organization. And that's one. The other thing I wanted to add to what Charles just said, yes, it's like, it's so powerful, this idea of decolonizing, but it's about taking out colonialism. What do you fill it with? And that's not so easy then to even know when we all grew up in that colonial mindset and organizations. Where is that authenticity that can also not be immediately found? You kind of need time. You need time to figure out your self-esteem, that what we may have to offer actually is of value too. And what was it in the first place? And you also don't want to go back into time to actually very patriarchal and old practices of global South societies, So it's really not easy to first find your voice, then wanting that to be a progressive voice and not going back to an authenticism of the past, which it could also be undermining the universal values, if I may say, of human rights that are so central to this line of work, and of course those needed to evolve as well. But it's a constant struggle to find who you are, what you want to promote. Do you want to transform it from inside? Is it still transformable, or is it just better to give up and start afresh and new? And I think Charles and I have been in many dialogues around decolonizing aid, where also there have been voices of, let's just, burn it all down, and because it's just too saturated with that old mentality. And that also doesn't lead to probably progress in the way we see it. But hey, that's how it works. And one has to be incredibly patient, really, really kind of commit to listening deeply and to different ways of describing dreams and desires, which may not come in the packaged way with the ribbon on top of it, as usually you need to present these ideas to donors, so we are all kind of formatted in that way. And it's very hard to shake that off. I struggle every day with shaking that off.
Yeah. Yeah, no, in early research, I looked at the sector, and I talked about the dominant idea of modernism rather than kind of colonialism, but just a way we also embody sort of this idea of modernism, of the way you measure things, compartmentalize things, and it's a very different way of thinking if you work with indigenous peoples, with people from different spaces. It's a very kind of European centric kind of way of thinking, and it not necessarily is always to do with colonialism, but just kind of, yeah, bureaucracy, kind of the way we categorize your 1, 2, 3, what you said, Sophia. It's all kind of steeped in there, and to sort of get away from modernism. But like the question you're both saying is kind of what fills that space, what fills that gap. I guess another question, like for humanitarianism, is universalism. Like, that stands behind humanitarianism, like this idea of the universal good, the universal human rights. What's your thoughts on that, both of you, on kind of, is there a universalism, or do we have to do everything locally and specific? Is it all has to be so contextualized that we have to think about this locally and specifically, because that's kind of the reality of it's different in every place we go to? Any thoughts on that?
I would say it's not an either or, it's always both, it's cannot, and there is some universalism of course, not accepting torture, and even if it may be a traditional practice and locally accepted, yes, I'm against female genital cutting, no matter what, the tradition may say. So I don't know, it's a mix of both. There are some, I believe there are some universal values of, of nonviolence, on no harm, on no inflicting harm to human beings, that we all should stick to. And then yes, and then there's contextual issues that needs to be addressed. And those universal might be quite few, but to me, some of those do exist. It's impossible for me to think that everything is relative depending on the culture. Now, how do you get from here to there? That's a different question, you know, in terms of the pace, the ways of doing that. But I do believe firmly in some universal values that are just impossible to renounce to.
Thank you. Charles?
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with Sophia about what she's saying about the universal values. And I mean, these are things that speak to our humanity. Without them, I mean, what is it that makes us humane? So whether there are certain practices that are kind of allowed or even encouraged in certain places, I think universally we are clear in our mind that there are certain things that if it harms a human being, these are things that we will not accept. I think the challenge is also sometimes it's about how then do we engage with communities to bring a certain understanding so that they can go through their own evolution of realization that maybe a certain practice is not a healthy thing. And I think most of the time there are so many opportunities when it comes to promoting human rights. But I think the challenge has always been the way we go about promoting human rights, sometimes from our own lenses or from our own perspectives, without trying to understand what the root causes of some of what we may deem to be harmful practices are. Yeah, but definitely, if you look across board, if you look at how human rights has evolved, we've come to a point where universally, there are certain things we agree on. We may not agree on certain nuances or, certain ways of going about dealing with certain issues, but we do agree that if something harms a human being directly, something takes away your freedom, something prevents you from having access to basic water, housing, those things that actually you're entitled to as a human, it's something that, we all abhor and try to fight against. Yeah.
So it seems to me that we agree that there's these basic humanitarian universal principles, and then like building on Sophia's kind of idea of nothing about us without us, or I talk about mutualism has to be in every conversation. It has to be, mutualism is a core kind of part of this work, which is saying the same thing as you, really, Sophia. It's a different language, but I come from an anarchist tradition, and mutualism was kind of that's what I grew up with, and it's a part of every conversation I had as a therapist, as in my work. It's like, you never accept a kind of a power over position. It's always, and you really understand that the other always has a voice, and they have more knowledge about their local conditions than you, and it's about kind of shifting that kind of power inside ourselves before we kind of do any work. What other issues are like, these are the big issues we're talking about? What other issues are on your minds at the moment which we need to discuss?
Well, on my mind is that much of what we're discussing here, it seems like it's not now what most in the aid sector everyone is thinking about, because of the very recent and just dramatic shifts in aid, that we're seeing even from last week, like stop working, and the backlash, and how progressive agendas are completely now under fire, right? So we are even kind of holding the fort of the gains that we have had, because there have been gains on decolonizing aid, on gender equality, on basic human rights. Even holding the fort sounds difficult. That's top of my mind, let alone making further progress, when it's falling apart in front of our eyes, Geneva Convention, international humanitarian law. I mean, the few things we had made progress on, and they're kind of essential to continue walking and continue. And I love the comment in the chat box with curiosity, with cultivating, but you need a few stepping stones and a sense of, okay, this has now been accomplished and reached, and now we can build on it further. And right now it's kind of crumbling under our feet, and it's very troubling right now. It's a complex moment, and I think of in the Andean Latin American context, there's indigenous women. They are often the guardians of the original seeds of the seeds that Monsanto has not taken over in the Andean context. And in a way, I think we would already be in this complex moment where, you know, billionaires are not only having more money but more power, and and basically invading the policy and the government space in such a huge way. Maybe it has never been different, but now it's even just out there without kind of any mask on. I wonder whether success would all be being the guardians of those seeds, of international humanitarian law, of principles that we believe in, no matter what, the dignity of every human being. I find myself thinking that it's so hard to be now out there and combating it. Must we be the guardians so that when a better time arises, we can still remember those seeds and plant them on more fertile ground? Sometimes you kind of have to nourish yourself before you can go back to that complex moment the world is living in.
Yeah, thank you.
So, you know, I think what is happening now, and I mean, what is happening now is not, I don't think is new either. I think it's been coming in different forms, in different ways. It's just getting a bit more intense now. I mean, it's clear that the current aid architecture, which is kind of driven by foreign policy considerations and vested interests, it's just not working, has not been working, and will not work, because the idea, even of those times when people were thinking about reaching out and doing charity, was about social justice. It was about solidarity, right? And so if you have an aid architecture that is being determined by foreign policy interests, right, you're not going to really have anything very effective. This is what you're going to have right now. So I think it's a time to really disrupt the whole idea of aid. So in this part of the world, we're trying to kind of lead conversations about, look, how do we here in our own domestic constituencies find different ways of generating resources or leveraging on resources, yes, money, but other resources to support work in the humanitarian space, to support work in the environmental space, to support work in the social justice space? Are there alternative forms of resources that we've not been looking at, you know, to do this work? Because this excessive dependency on an aid architecture that is really collapsing is not really going to help us and sustain the kind of work that we want to do, especially help our communities to become more resilient. So for us, I think many of us here, if you speak to Degan and others, we saw this coming. It's been coming for so many years. And some of us have been shouting on the rooftops that, look, yes, funding from our INGO partners, funding from foundations is really great, and we're really grateful. But if it doesn't help us find a way to diversify and to find different ways of supporting the work that we do, we're going to have a very difficult time when certain things happen. And we could see it happening in terms of how the policies have been evolving over the years, making it very, very difficult for organizations that actually need this funding to access it. Right, we've seen how an industry has been built and how we you know, all this money is feeding back into that into that industry. So I think there needs to be a global kind of conversation. How do we just turn upside down this whole aid architecture? I don't know what we want to call it, but definitely what we have now is not going to sustain us into the future.
Yeah, I mean that's that's interesting. You both brought two different aspects. One of being a guardian of the kind of central tenants and the gains we've made, and the other, like seeing this disruption, these cracks as an opportunity in a way, as a time to really rethink the kind of overarching models. And I guess both feed into each other. You rethink it, but with these seeds, with these kind of truths, with these beliefs, with these gains we've already had, and then seeing kind of what that looks like for the future. And it would probably look, go.
No, from a gender equality and feminist perspective, what we're seeing now in terms of what is being lost right now in many parts of the world is just huge, you know. So that's where one needs to think of what seeds do we need to preserve for and try to cultivate, of course. But there must be other ways. It's not in that aid architecture. There must be other paths to this. But it's the horrific moment of the backlash that we're seeing across the globe, and with no one. I mean, I don't know where some of the leaders are that have stood up for all of this. They seem lost, completely lost, and timid and fearful. And then they show their true masks as well, because it's about pleasing and the power rather than really being true to these values with which they have filled their mouths for years and years, you know. And I'm speaking about a large spectrum, not about the obvious far right where there's no question there, but about everybody else, you know. It's how timid everyone seems to be about. I mean, even look at, if I may, because it's probably top of our minds from last week, from the executive orders that the new US administration put out. And you think, okay, half of that country didn't vote for this. It was pretty close, the election. And yet everyone else seems fearful to speak more handedly against it, while they have, it wasn't 80-20 or 10-90 that election, like in other parts of the world, you know, it was pretty split. So where are the voices from other corners that say we still have a large constituency to build on? Everyone is kind of freaking out and being fearful, and that scares me.
Yeah. I mean, I was just having this conversation with a friend, and I was saying what has happened in Gaza is just shows me how the world has gone quiet and silent. Just to buttress what Sophia was saying, it's a tragedy, and I think the impact of that, and it's all linked to what we have, this conversation that we're having, where is the leadership, right? Where are those voices of reason? You just can't find them anymore. And so it looks like the power is shifting from the main power centers, but I think people are failing to recognize that power is shifting from the main power centers. And so for me, it's a really sad state of affairs on what is happening. Back in the days, we used to talk about standards, and you make references to certain countries in Europe and in America. Now I'm even scared to do that when I meet people because I'm having conversations with students, because they're like, who is what? US? No, Charles. I don't think they're an example. There are people there who are leading, who may not even be mayors in some of our small towns. So it becomes a very huge challenge in terms of now what the global thinking is on standards of leadership, on values. So it's a very, very difficult time. And I think that's why I think it's important as a sector that we come more closer together, put out the North-South kind of conversations, really go back and try to find our intrinsic value, and really share experiences. There are experiences in certain places that are not mainstream, but I think can really help with these difficult times. So I'm looking forward to doing things differently. Yeah.
You're so right, Charles. I couldn't agree more. And some words have actually been really, really damaging, because like localization, like it also suggests that if you're a local NGO, you can only add value locally and not provide a global vision that may emerge from the global south. Why are some parts of the world more global than others? Everyone is local and global at the same time. And, so everything is like compartmentalized, and only a few have the privilege of being more global and kind of working all across the planet, and even that mindset is damaging. But I agree with everything that we are seeing in Gaza in particular, everything that has been built, and of course this has been going on now for a year, is just it's very hard to find those leaders, no matter where in the world, that have really stood out and sticking to what I think we all here believe in. So how do you build those larger progressive movements that across the globe, when we ourselves are being kind of localized and seen as local and not able to influence a broader spectrum of ideas and realities?
Yeah, I mean, this series is called Ecosystems of Radical Change because we're drawing on ideas from social movements, from feminist ideas, from how social movements change leadership from the edge. So rather than looking for the central leadership, thinking about rebuilding ground up structures, leadership from the edge, building ecosystems of solidarity, where we can find our voices again, where we can experiment. So this is the work we're doing. Thank you both so much. This has been a really, really rich conversation. We'll end there, I think. It's been lovely speaking to you both.